I first got interested in Magic the Gathering when I was a kid in the mid-90s, and around the same time I first started playing RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. Magic the Gathering was new and exciting. They'd figured out the formula for not only a pretty fun game, but how to tap into that addictive high you get when you open new cards to add to your collection. When I say Magic the Gathering needs to die, don't get me wrong. I love Magic, and there are some iconic mechanics in the game that make it Magic the Gathering. But I think it's time for version 2.0. I'd recently gotten some Forgotten Realms cards, Modern Horizons 2, and I'm about to get some of the Midnight Hunt set. But Magic the Gathering is very much a product of its time. The design philosophies of games within the nerdosphere of that time have certain elements that honestly aren't always actually fun for everyone at the table. Role-playing game systems like Dungeons & Dragons have been reworked and streamlined time and time again. Do away with all of these bulky mechanics. And although not perfect, the current tabletop RPGs of the modern day just play so much nicer than those old mechanics. Will these changes mean it's still Magic the Gathering? Of course. Look at RPGs. For example, although some of the terminology of Dungeons & Dragons, like ability scores, saving throws, armor class, etc. still exist, they are basically the same in name only, and work completely differently than when I started playing back in 2nd edition. And some of the iconic rules, like THAC0, gone entirely. Why? Because progress needed to be made. They weren't needed anymore. Better ideas came along. D&D wasn't the only game to do this. Shadowrun, although it kept a few ideas to tie it back into being Shadowrun, has basically revamped the core mechanics of its system dramatically over time. But it's still Shadowrun. And frankly, 4th edition was one of my most played and favorite versions of that game. It worked dramatically different than the previous versions, but it was still very much Shadowrun. I'm talking about mechanics that are needlessly bulky and complex. They cause a lack of fun for one or more people at the table, or are just generally a mess. This is why I think Magic the Gathering needs a bit of a rework, because the game itself, although it has a brilliant history and lots of flavorful cards, has a ton of baggage that I think needs to be cleared out. Now, this is where some of you invariably will yell at me, saying something like, "Well, then just play standard formats, the old stuff is rotated out." Here's the thing, my problem isn't with the design of the majority of the cards. Although some more strict design guidelines are needed, I think, it's with some of the core fundamental designs of the game itself I have some issues. Let's go on an adventure here, as I'd like to go over some of the things that I think need to be changed if we ever get a Magic the Gathering. This one is an easy change, and something you can even house rule at a friendly table to fix the current version of Magic. So I'm going to go start here. Drawing a full hand and choosing to either be stuck with it or take a mulligan and lose a card, with some format exceptions, it can be pretty harsh. I've had a lot of games where I just conceded because of pure dumb bad luck. I'll have a deck with plenty of lands, mana ramp, tutors, and cards that I want, but then for like 3 to 4 mulligans in a row, just pull the worst possible hands. One I would definitely not win with, and now have a huge handicap against my opponent if I even tried, resulting in me just conceding. This is supposed to be a game of strategy, tactics, combos, creativity. Then you could lose before you even start just because of luck? You've spent hours and possibly tens, hundreds, or in extreme cases thousands of dollars to craft that perfect deck. You sit at the table and just draw hand after hand after hand of bullshit. Many of you will say, "Well, you didn't just build your deck properly to the tutor and ramp past it." Well, if you have to customize your deck in a very particular manner to overcome a shortfall of the rules, then A, maybe the rules are kind of bad for that, and B, that cuts down on the creativity and diversity you could be seeing in the deck lists, because you have to build certain things into your deck in order to work. There are 2 ways I think this can be mitigated. First, and something I think is more traditional to card games, is to be given the option to get rid of and redraw X amount of individual cards from your hand. You see this in the current digital version of Gwent, a card game that, although I have a few problems with it, I think they also did a lot right. And it's not like a selective redraw is a new concept. Card games like poker have done this for centuries. The second idea is to make every card have some sort of instant easy use. This is a method I'm putting into my own card-based RPG that I'm designing. Here's an example of a card. Keep in mind, this is just a pre-alpha design concept, and I've totally redesigned the layouts and looks like 4 or 5 times now, so this may change. But one mechanic I have kept is the ability for every card to have a basic use no matter what it says on the card. In the case of the game I'm designing, each card can be chosen to be played with the normal card text, like in Magic, or used for its basic attack and defense numbers. So every card can be useful 100% of the time. This way, even if in the final hand you have isn't ideal, there will still be no cards in your hand that are useless to you. In fact, in my game, I'm allowing both selective redraw and having this standard mechanic to my cards. Between the two of them, no player should have to worry that they're going to get screwed over because of pure dumb luck. Not all cards in your hand will be as effective if you just play them for their basic use, which still promotes the need for tactics and strategy, but it also means you are never in a situation where you're unable to do anything productive. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to simplify Magic to the point where it's basically a game of Go Fish. Manipulating the flow of the cards, the numbers, +1 counters, tokens, all of these things are what draws a person like me to Magic over fun little pre-built card games. But there is another mechanic that introduces the concept of losing through bad luck that isn't as easy to change as the draw mechanic, and that's the economy of lands and mana. In Commander, which I think is generally growing to be the more and more most popular format of Magic, it's suggested by most communities that in your average deck, about 20% of your deck are lands, and 10% of your deck are ramping cards to get you those lands or extra mana. That is almost 1/3 of your deck devoted to your action economy alone with no other use. That is 1/3 of your deck devoted to cards that are kind of boring, so that you can play something that is actually fun. And in other formats like Standard, depending on what color you're playing, sometimes this can range closer to 40% of your deck. When playing Arena, I had one night where I played 7 games in a row without conceding at any point in the games. During those 7 games, with very minimal use of ramp mechanics, I drew almost nothing but lands. I even had my friend Malik watching me in disbelief at the terrible luck that I had. This wasn't even a deck with excessive amounts of land. In fact, it had a few less lands than the defaults Arena suggests for the deck. But, turn after turn after turn, for 7 games, I drew almost nothing but land. Is this normal? No. That is a really strange statistical anomaly, and I'll probably never have it happen again. But the thing is, it shouldn't have been able to happen. The mechanics of your games shouldn't have to rely on a statistical average to keep things in check, not if it's been balanced. Honestly, I think the whole idea about lands needs to be tossed, but there are 2 ways I can see to fix this. Okay, one of the ways, and this is probably the more unpopular of the ideas, is let's just get rid of the lands entirely. Replace them with some sort of points system. Although I'm not the biggest fan of Hearthstone, running off of an ever-increasing point system was leagues better than the outdated land system of Magic, and although I think Gwent is pretty fun, I feel being able to play only a single card per turn isn't as satisfying. I do like the numbers that mana gives us in Magic. It's another thing to tinker with, and most Magic players really like to tinker. But maybe replacing them with some sort of increasing point system isn't a bad idea. Still want special types of environments like the snow-covered stuff? Have some cool enchantments or a single land card as a representative of that does that. Maybe something like the day-night mechanics that have been introduced in Midnight Hunt. Still want to have your deck devoted to certain colors? Maybe just have land devotion cards that show what colors your deck are. And each turn you get X number of mana to spend, but you have to choose between the colors you have represented by those devotions. Or instead of maybe one of the points of mana, you get to lay down a new color devotion. Then you get the choice of increasing the complexity of what you can cast and casting something small, versus getting the power to cast something bigger. I personally think the traditional basic lands can just be tossed entirely. I do not see a need for them. I'm not saying do away with the concept of lands, but I think needing multiple land cards randomly drawn from your deck is a pretty big mistake. Magic already uses counters for health, dice for rolling. Why not all of this for mana? There's also another idea I had for the fix. If you really want to keep lands separate, and retain the old ramping mechanics of old, then this change could be made even to the current Magic system. remove all lands out of your primary deck and move them into a land deck. When you choose a deck to play, you may now choose 2 decks, your primary deck and a land deck. This has 2 benefits. With some rules about when and how often you can draw from your land deck, you never have to worry about becoming mana starved or flooded by nothing but lands. Secondly, you can use the same land deck for multiple different primary decks. This cuts down on the number of mostly useless junk cards floating around. I mean, let's be honest, you're a Magic player, you probably have a literal box of nothing but land cards sitting around. There are of course other fixes out there as well. Back in the late 90s, I remember my group came up with a rule set known as Empire Magic. Basically, all of the land cards were laid on the table in a grid with a clear sheet of plastic over them. Then instead of drawing, placing, and tapping mana, we reworked the certain rules to place and remove little tokens on the lands. We just used those cheap glass dollar store fish tank things. Each turn, you could attempt to conquer lands to generate more mana, but as you consumed mana, you lost control of those lands. We basically turned Magic into a strategy game with cards. You can even start to conquer and control lands your opponents needed for their own deck to cut off resources, but then retain those conquered lands. You couldn't use mana, so it was a bit of a double-edged sword. It was great fun, and honestly I've been thinking hard about reviving this format and writing out a clear set of rules. Let me know down below if you would be interested in this. Maybe we can all collaborate together to modernize it and release it to the Magic community. Counterspell. Destroy target creature. Exile. Board wipes. Losing your entire turn. Mechanics that deny you from playing the game. Whether it's a video game, card game, board game, RPG, I am a firm believer that denial mechanics, aka a mechanic that stops a player from being able to play fun stuff, should be rarely available. This is the reason when I run a role-playing game, I very rarely use stun or control mechanics on my players. There's nothing worse in a game than when you start to say, "Hey, this'll be fun, I wanna," and someone interrupts you with, "No, you're done now." But in Magic, assuming your deck isn't outright devoted to denial mechanics, it's still expected that you have another approximately 10% of your deck as these types of cards, removals, counters, etc. This is the suggested amount in a commander deck by some of the most knowledgeable content creators around for Magic. 10% of the deck and cards whose entire focus is just to tell the other player, "I'm not letting you." Don't get me wrong, I still run these cards sometimes. I have a blue milling deck that honestly is probably one of the most aggravating and annoying things to play against. Aside from the milling mechanic, it has a huge amount of denial mechanics built in as well. And I almost never play it. Why? Because it stops the other player from having fun. Unless you're in some pro tournament, having fun playing the game with someone is literally the point of it all. Denial mechanics should be rare, maybe difficult to enact or limited in some way. Hell, maybe all 3. I'm not saying get rid of them entirely. It's still a needed concept to be able to deal with some of the overwhelming combos that's in play. You need a mechanic to disassemble these obstacles. But they should be few in number or more difficult to use. Denial mechanics are sometimes fun for the person playing them, but very, very rarely fun for the person they're played against. If I'm in an arena and I see a blue-black deck and the first 5 spells they play are counter, counter, destroy, yeah, I'm not having fun because I'm sitting here basically doing nothing. I'm not playing this game to do nothing, I'm playing this game to do something. I'd rather be stuck playing a crappy card like Mindless Null than just to be told no when I try to play anything. Denial mechanics are one of the big facets of Magic that I think sort of ruin the gaming experience for a larger portion of the player base than you'd think. The fact that you are expected these days to have X amount of cards of this type in your deck deal with the fact that your opponents also probably have a similar amount or more of it in their deck. Well, it's like a Cold War of building up cards whose express job is to cause less fun for your opponent. Imagine if all video games devoted 10 to 30% of all things that happen to you as mechanics that just stop you from playing the game. Constantly being stun-locked, blinded, etc. Mechanics that just make you sit there and unable to do anything for minutes at a time. I'm not talking about like a quick stutter in movement or blanking your screen for a second. I'm talking about sitting there for a few minutes, unable to play the game. Unless it was targeted at a very specific, niche, masochistic audience, any video game like this is going to get terrible reviews and be referred to as just a bad game. But we accept it as part of Magic because that's just the way it's been quite a long time. Bad Hair Gaming, who, by the way, is an amazing streamer on Twitch you should check out, he's super interactive and fun on his streams, posed a concern to me when I planned this video. Something that's not only valid, but I think maybe even deserves its own discussion and video. Many people don't like the idea of big changes to the game because, is it even still Magic the Gathering at that point? What if we use my idea to get rid of lands and just have a couple to represent your color devotions? As I mentioned earlier in the video, after seeing sweeping changes to tabletop role-playing games while retaining their identity, to me it would still be Magic the Gathering, just a new version. This can be true for all games. Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 had remarkably different skill and leveling systems in place. Whether you like them or not isn't the question, but the important bit is, it was still very much Diablo, despite the change in its core mechanics. But, Devil's Advocate, or I guess Bad Hair Gaming's advocate, what can you change, and how far can you change it, and still call the game Magic the Gathering? That's the question, and despite my personal views on it, I think that it is still a matter of perspective. I feel it would be a newer version of the game, modernized, refined even, with a few major changes like to the land system. Not everyone feels that way. I think there are people out there that desire land cards, the denial mechanics, the mulligan system, that these are the very things that make Magic, Magic. Mechanics that have been relatively unchanged for almost 30 years. So I'm going to leave this video with two questions. Do you believe Magic needs a rework? That it's time we refreshed and refined the game? And if you do think there are mechanics in Magic that need some changes, what are they?